Ladies and gentlemen, warmly welcome to this Thursday afternoon keynote lecture to be given by Professor Sverker Sörlin. This is one of the key events during our week-long discussions on the topic of academic freedom. And Sverker will today talk on the topic of academic integrity. Sverker Sörlin is a non-resident long-term fellow for programs on environmental humanities here at SCAS. So we have the privilege of having him come here every now and then for strategic discussions and interaction with our fellows. He's also professor of environmental history at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. He was originally trained as an intellectual historian and is now, I may say, a leading voice in environmental humanities. As we all know, he has a long-standing career not only in scholarship and academic leadership, but also in research policy advice and as a public intellectual. He has, among other things, written critically and reflexively on the history, future, and conditions of the humanities, on the art of, and indeed necessity of, Bildung, or learning together, as exemplified in the book Till bildningens försvar, den svåra konsten att veta tillsammans, published 3 years ago. He's also written on the role of humanities in society, for example, with Professor Anders Ekström in the book Alltings mått, humanistisk kunskap i framtidens samhälle, written in 2015. So, warmly welcome, Sverker Sörlin.
Thank you very much for these welcoming words and also for inviting me to this week-long event. And I should say it's a pleasure to see so many assembled here among colleagues and fellows, if I may say so, and other friends of science. It's also a very welcome initiative, this week-long discussion, conversation. Issues of academic freedom, collegiality, and integrity have become more central in recent years. And one might say for sad reasons. I certainly think so myself. I remember very vividly the many years of my academic past when most of us happily disregarded issues like these, or at least I did, took it for granted that things were pretty okay. As an example of this, I spent quite a lot of time at the University of Oslo over the years, and I learned on one of those visits there about a committee in Norway they had put together maybe 10, 12 years ago, with a remit to present a proposal for a new and reinforced regulation of academic freedom. And there was a Swedish member of this committee that I remember we met by chance in the airport in Oslo and talked about it. And I think we both sort of smiled at this remarkable mission by the Norwegians. Wasn't it a bit anxious and over the top? Was it right to regulate? I basically thought then, I remember this very clearly, and with some shame actually now, that I thought it was more like a gesture, perhaps even an empty gesture. And I reminded the Swedish colleague that we had our 3 freedoms set down in Swedish law: the right to freely choose topic of research, the right to freely choose the research method, and the right to freely publish research results. That's no small thing, of course, but that was sort of what came to mind. And I had myself been a member of the Swedish government's Science Advisory Board on Research when this little freedom charter of Swedish research, or perhaps we should say Swedish researchers as individuals, was presented. It came as part of a research bill in the 1990s. But of course, the weak spot of this freedom charter was that it was solely focused on the individual. It said really nothing about the wider freedom issues of academia, so to speak, as a whole, nor about our role as teachers or as collaborators with the wider society, and the freedom of our institutions to execute a forceful role in society and for our ways of running our institutions. So already by hinting at these areas, I suggest that there are many dimensions of freedom that we may want to explore as we talk about these matters. And I must admit that these issues have also more recently become an issue which I've been a little bit more interested in than I used to be back then at the airport of Oslo. Maybe as an example of this, I could just show a little example. In the research bill that the government presented a few years ago, I think it was in December 2020, the freedom theme was actually brought up. And by then, I must admit that I embraced this idea. I praised that part of the bill, actually. Because by then we had seen enough to be convinced that it may become a reality, that we will have to defend our most basic principles and ideas in real turf fighting against perhaps even political leaders, however democratically elected, that may wish to compromise them, or even worse. And I can recall also the moment, a sort of eye-opening moment for me, when this prospect went from a vague idea to something which came with some more concreteness. And for me, there was a connection to Uppsala, actually. A bit unexpected, even for myself, I must say. At a Nobel dinner, I happened to be seated next to the Rectrix Magnifica of Uppsala, Eva Åkesson. This must have been 2014 or 2015, I'm not entirely sure. And our conversation meandered, as they should do by a dinner table. And all of a sudden, quite unprovoked, I think, by whatever subject we covered, Eva said, and quite sharply, I remember, that we need to think about times that can be much harsher than anything we've seen. They can come sooner than we think. And I was a bit perplexed, I remember. I'd seen no tendencies of alarmism in her. And after all, she was the leader of one of Sweden's most respected and certainly one of the largest universities. So I sort of asked her, how would this start? Thinking again about the freedoms of the individual researcher that I just mentioned, that we had secured, so to speak, back in the 1990s. Eva said, it will start with a curriculum. They can regulate what subjects we teach. And I still thought at that moment that this idea was a little bit exotic. But I sort of agreed, not only politely, but also in principle, but it sort of left me a little bit thinking about this. And now I also started, so soon 10 years ago, thinking a bit more seriously about this prospect. Perhaps it is time to get our act together. I was entertaining these kinds of thought. And we see changes that are sweeping across several sectors of society these days, even in this country. These sectors are different. The logics are not always the same. The level of rationality in public policy differs somewhat between policy areas. And I think by and large, they show a common pattern of devaluating freedom. They show a distrust towards expertise, insight, and judgment based on experience and evidence. The most rapid changes right now, as far as I can see, are in the legal field, so to speak, legal regulation, principles of criminal law and punishment, and in certain principles of human rights. But questions concerning education, both in schools and in adult education, studieförbund och folkhögskolor, as we say in Swedish, and in higher education, are concerns too. All kinds of institutions seem to run the risk of being involved in some instrumental duty to bring down, for example, the numbers of people in the country who were not supposed to be here or were not born here, to take just one example. The belief in knowledge of the individual, or even of the entire population, as has been so important before, as an instrument both of individual emancipation and collective action, and the effectiveness of our society to reach our goals. These principal matters seem to somehow have lost their appeal in certain leading political strata. So I think what we're doing now is crucial, and hence a good idea to talk about during a week like this. On me has fallen, for reasons I cannot fully fathom, to address the concept of academic integrity. Not that I have anything against it. On the contrary, I'm rather fond of those words. We have been talking previously during this week about academic freedom, about collegiality, two subjects I think also that most of us know fairly well by now. They have been addressed for a number of years. Academic integrity seems to me, well, it's very, very old in one way, but it's also quite recent in the sense that it hasn't been so much actively discussed. And I think this may vary between countries a little bit too, as I will speak about in a moment. On the other hand, it is perhaps the most basic of topics, and I would say eternal for universities. As we will see, it is about things impossible to not have heard about as an academic. The difference, I think, now is that we tend to bring them out more and talk about it more. But the question is, as always, how we talk about academic integrity and how we engage with the topic in different parts of the university. And again, there is a wide range between the individual, the student or the scholar, the researcher, on the one hand, and the institutional and societal position of the higher education sector and its responsibilities. And I hope to be able to return a little bit to those various dimensions and levels toward the end. Maybe I should start by trying to offer a kind of definition. And there are plenty of those around, or varieties on a theme. And many universities have their own particular versions. I have a couple of examples for you here. This is a modest little thing that the Netherlands, it represents the Netherlands Code of Conduct for Academic Practice. It was presented in 2004. And it is, it's a national approach. It's something that an entire nation has somehow taken on to follow. And I also cite it because it's fairly early as a definition. And you will recognize the words. These are code words that we appreciate in academia. We like honesty. We like to be scrupulous. And we want to be reliable. We have various mechanisms to uphold that. We verify our facts. We don't just claim things. We have sources or experiments behind them. We try to be impartial, independent, and we try to be responsible. At the same time, going through a number of documents like this over the past couple of weeks, I must also say I'm a little bit disappointed because it's almost invariably things that you learned long ago. So there is, it's not much of a surprise. And this has, in a sense, surprised me. Why do we publish documents like these when the content of them is pretty obvious? We can expand a little bit by just showing one more. This is from a website of a company that there is a certain commercial activity in this area too. This is called Turnitin. You may have heard about it. They provide all kinds of services. They have a very active website. They have software that they present that can trace cheating, for example, and plagiarism. And here is a little bit more of the language. Honesty is again there, with a few details. Be truthful, give credit, provide facts. Not perhaps terribly exciting. Trust, you should be transparent, trust others, give credence, and so on. Maybe I should address under courage that, perhaps not surprising, but a little bit more interesting to me at least. Yeah, you should also not just present all these virtues of academic behavior, but you should also address wrongdoing when somebody else does something that you shouldn't he or she shouldn't do, you should actually confront them with it. You should endure the discomfort that may be involved in bringing these ethical or other issues up. Now, this gives you a sort of flavor, and the source for Turnitin, a company that they use, is actually a center, an international center of academic integrity, ICAI, which was founded in 1992. It's an international organization. Obviously, they call this list that we have in front of you for the fundamental values of academic integrity. And they were listed and identified in this form in 1999, if you trust the ICAI. This honesty, trust, fairness, respect, responsibility. As late as in 2014, the courage dimension was added. And I go through this because I want to somehow signal that this is a recent development. So one kind of conversation around academic integrity is about some sort of activities and responses going on in our own time, in a sense. And you could also read, not just on their webpage, but in other places, that the concept of academic integrity has come to represent increasingly student integrity. So it has been a sort of a focus on students. And in this origination narrative, there are also certain person names mentioned. This is not an area I work in myself, so it's not people I have much sort of knowledge about. But one seminal figure seems to be an educationist by the name Don McCabe at Rutgers University, who was part of setting this international center up in 1992, and very much connected to the popularization of the term and the spread of the term academic integrity in this recent format, so to speak. There are now also journals, scientific journals, publishing new research in this field. And I've read a little bit from that literature over the past few weeks too, to acquaint myself with current orthodoxy. One is the publishing channel of ICAI, namely the International Journal of Educational Integrity, and that started coming out in 2005. So again, an indicator of the kind of temporality of the rise of this field. So we have a situation where very basic and certainly age-old features of academic life and how to lead it, to cite correctly and to not plagiarize, to give your sources, to certainly behave in an appropriate way, how to lead academic life in a sense, how to perform, how to behave according to academic standards, where such standards need to be made explicit and rehearsed and researched on a growing scale after hundreds of years. I'll qualify that a little bit in a moment. But so we have this understanding, these kind of virtues existing for a long time, and now accelerating into a situation where they add to a language using certain phrases, certain concepts about academic values, academic collegiality, academic freedom, academic integrity, academic responsibility, and there are a few more that you can list on this. They're now brought out in articulated version. So having spent decades in this world of academic life, I'm still perplexed, as you may perceive here, that this has escaped me somehow until now, when it's sort of brought out. And I think it's at least reason for me enough to think about how we should understand this phenomenon. So, first of all, we may, of course, say the obvious, namely that knowledge knows no boundaries, and where there is a scientific curiosity popping up, there will certainly be research, and where there is research, there will be publications and journals. And academic integrity is no exception. The leading practitioners of this as an academic field suggest that the work they do is, of course, essential. I suppose everybody suggests that their work is essential. But there is one particular strand of that argument that I've sort of was particularly observant about, and it's when these practitioners talk about this as being important for upholding society. And the argument for this view is that the research seems to show that misconduct in academia travels to the post-academic workplace. So those who deviate in school, they tend to continue to do so later in life when they pursue various careers. And that's, of course, not good at all. On the other hand, maybe a bit more good news, perhaps, for the universities, is that the levels of cheating and misconduct that is reported in this kind of literature of academic integrity seem to be higher in lower stages, so in high school age, than in college. Also, younger students tend to be more relaxed about cheating. But do remember that my knowledge here is not comprehensive, but this is my impression at least. The data tend to be quite regional, that's another observation I make, limited to certain countries. The Anglophone countries dominate, but Asia is also quite big. Especially there seems to be a concern where international students gather in large numbers. One such country is Australia, which pops up quite a lot in this area. And I think this is also an aspect in how to sort of understand the rise of this area. Many interesting, but I think already well-known cultural differences are reported in this literature. Styles of learning, learning cultures, shape how students regard, for example, plagiarism. Some cultures favor repetitive, memorizing approaches. Other common in Western countries favor diversity and individualism, but could also, on the other hand, be quite lax in observing misconduct. And one very interesting discussion, I think, is about the impact of known misconduct on the status of academic institutions. And here we come into an interesting area. Research data on so-called academic scandals, and this was from the US, were cited in a study that I read that suggested that if the scandal has been reported in the New York Times, the application rates to that institution drops the following year by around 10%. And similar results were found if scandals turned up repeatedly in relevant magazines, such as the US News and World Report, a journal or a magazine that, as we know, is the go-to magazine for students and parents looking for colleges. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the new world of research organizations and systematic effort to identify, quantify, report, research, mitigate, and deal with the consequences of educational misconduct or integrity can hence be viewed, actually, against the backdrop of a rapidly growing and competitive marketplace academia. So here is a little bit of a suggestion towards how we can understand this phenomenon. So with that said, perhaps I could try to say a little about the historical background here, very, very briefly, to the current situation if we stretch a little bit further back. And I will have to limit myself primarily to the United States, for which this has been well covered. Perhaps in the discussion after my talk, we could hear more evidence from Sweden, Nordic countries, Europe, and so on. And just a couple of small observations here. First of all, the relationship between this kind of discussion around academic integrity and misconduct and so on, related to the concept of honor. Honor, of course, is linked to honesty, to codes of conduct, and professions have always been very interested in the reputation of the members of their profession, and the academic profession is no exception from that. But it really caught my attention when I read in this literature about Southern American universities having a problem with this, because there was another code of conduct or another concept of honor that was even more important to the students. Namely, the Southern Code, as it was called, recognized that saving face is more important than conforming to moral or ethical standards of behavior. So for the students, in order to save face and not, they would be prepared to cheat. They would be, so the integrity was sort of compromised by other standards of society. And I thought that was, so clashes of honor could occur also between the faculty and the students. And that goes way back, even before, to the antebellum period, before the Civil War in the United States. If you look at data of this phenomenon of misconduct, it seems also to have been around for quite some time, perhaps forever. And the period, well, the 20th century, basically, the rise of the research universities and the stratification of the American academia, we have data from the 1930s and 1940s and onwards, where a significant percentage of the students admitted to academic cheating. And there are several investigations from those years. And it was, so to speak, a problem already then. And the problem stayed on in the 60s and 70s, the growth of the mass university, where there was also a mass problem with this. So widespread fraud, widespread cheating in North American colleges for generations. Still, it seems to have become a more serious concern in recent years, hence all this activity and the conceptualization. There is also a sense of level playing field thinking here that weighs in, both on the side of the institutions which need to be identified as valid and integrity-oriented, to be fair and appropriate, and on the side of the students. So if your fellow students are not fair to you, you have not to be fair to them, and also you run the risk of lagging behind if you behave honestly, if they don't, so to speak. There is a cleaning work going on as this enormous battle against misconduct just expands with the growing higher education worldwide. And there is a clear need also among the institutions to keep abreast with the innovation of dishonesty methods and technologies. And I think this has become quite topical with the rise of AI, but it doesn't stop there. A vital line of research is on, at least in my reading of this, on dishonesty technologies, as they are called. And I must admit, it's been quite shocking to read into this literature. I had no idea of the level of sophistication applied to reach so low and off-putting goals. A decade ago, there was already debates around online paraphrasing tools, mobilizing tons of linguists to engage in the analysis of these tools. And I read now from one of these articles published in 2017. And here comes a quote. These websites, are freely available to students, leading to a new label covering the use of these tools as essay spinning. And then there's a reference to some literature. However, these spinning tools are equally available to academics, that is, faculty members and researchers, who may be enticed with a notion of repurposing already published content as a way of increasing research output. And of course, we touch then on discussions about scientific productivity. And we touch about the race for publication and for numbers and evaluation tools and so on. So although the abuse seems to be more widely spread among students, it is also used by researchers. And AI and the recent generations of chatbots have drawn a lot of interest also in this community, and the implications of these technologies for higher education institutions are certainly researched and assessed. Again, I'm somewhat taken aback by the spread and growth of these phenomena. And maybe I should disclose that I haven't been very much engaged myself in undergraduate teaching for some time now, and certainly not on the mass side of mass higher education. For example, where masses of students are taught in professional schools on an almost industrial scale. So perhaps I've been a little bit protected, but reading into it now, I'm amazed and fascinated. I'm more personally familiar myself with the publishing world and its deviations and the debates around those, which of course also is very much linked to the concept of academic integrity. That's an area of danger and temptations. And I suppose everybody who has been around in the publishing world in recent years have seen the changes going on. If you submit to journals, it has become increasingly formalized with ever higher demands on specificity. Who did what part of this work? Was any part of the work previously published, etc.? There is a large number of so-called predatory journals that seem to go precisely after republications or spinned publications and paraphrased versions of already published work. And I suppose most of us, like me, get invitations from these kinds of journals all the time. They seem to pop up from everywhere, like the heads of the Hydra. You cut one off, there are 10 more. But the fact that they proliferate suggests that they also do catch some fish. Who respond then? Who can they get? Well, who are the dishonest academics, or students for that matter? I suppose that's an empirical question. Improving career prospects certainly is a driver here, but some research I've seen also suggests that it's not just about being tactical. It's also to do very much with sentiments or emotions. If you feel maltreated, if you yourself feel abused in academia, not recognized enough by your professors or peers, then you seem to be more prone to adopt deviating behavior. And also then in this research, as a response to these findings, there has been a discussion recently about punitive methods to deal with dishonesty as lacking. It's not the only way to punish harder. There seems to be an increasing interest in softer approaches like guidance, advice, counseling that can help those who deviate come back to the right way, so to speak. So almost as a kind of an abuse treatment. All fascinating, I think. Well, it's tempting to go on and report from this underworld of misconduct and how it relates to the transformations of modern higher education and research. Well, indeed, a sad report, but one that may prompt us to consider, perhaps even rethink, some of the parameters of our institutions. So, what sort of academia did we produce that in turn produces these deviations? It's something to think about. It's not just this world of deviations, it's also something that addresses us back, I think. What academia do we have, and was it always like this? And how serious is the problem, so to speak? So the last question first, how serious is the problem? I've taken some interest in the quality problem before, on and off over my career. We often hear about problems of research quality, the replication crisis of psychological experiments, for example, that has been discussed for a long time, on the seemingly growing frequency of data fabrication and the scandals related to that. I told you about Oslo before. I lived in Oslo in 2006 when odontology research in Norway was disclosed with data fabrication. There was a particular case. And after 17 years, I still remember the surname of the fraudster from reading the newspapers in Oslo at the time. And I discovered that I remembered it, because I haven't thought about it for years, when I wrote the very sentence that I just read to you. That was fascinating, that this sort of has stayed. And this debate in Norway at the time was for me a thorough introduction to the Vancouver rules, for example, which were mainly applied on this fraudster's co-authors, who claimed that they were totally innocent because they were not aware of the fraud but acted in good faith as co-authors. But as the Vancouver rules state, if you are behind an article as an author, you are behind everything in it and should be aware of the methods used for getting the information, although you didn't do any of the fraudulent activity yourself. Scandals get attention, of course, and we read about them, we hear about complaints from the journals and so on. And they may create the impression that the situation is universally bad. But here's another example. I tried in 2018 and 2019 for the purpose of a small section in a book I was writing at the time to get a sense of how bad it was actually. This was a very small kind of little mini inquiry that I did. At least I was curious. Could we trust science these days? Should we be very worried? So I read up on some of the literature. Well, no big worry, I would say. My impression was that, yes, there is fraud, yes, there are some problems, but compared to the growing size of the scientific enterprise, not much worse than it always was. But again, I assume we don't know all that much historically. I remember that what excitement it was among us PhD students at Umeå University when I was in the 1980s, when Martin Gardner's book appeared in 1981, the year I started PhD training, entitled Science, Good, Bad, and Bogus. That was something to read. But the genre itself is older. Charles Babbage, already in the 19th century, wrote his book Reflections on the Decline of Science in England and Some of Its Causes, attacking what he perceived as fraud in some of his colleagues. So there's always been this kind of thing too. Others may have a different impression of this. I can only account for my small contacts with the field. But I haven't had reason, I think, to change my mind, at least not yet. So we seem to have a somewhat split opinion here. On the one hand, an educational problem to do with students cutting corners, abusing new technological opportunities, creating problems for their universities, but also for themselves and potentially for societies. On the other hand, we have a scientific enterprise where, yes, some fraud is undeniable, but where most of the business seems reasonably sound. You can question me afterwards, but that's my view. So first of all, we can ask the question, is this a valid impression? At least it makes some sense to me. It seems to me that the risk of students to deviate, now coming to the explanation, I think there is a risk of students to deviate that is actually somehow bigger. They can be disclosed and still go on. They could even change to another school. The fall, I think, of a student is lower. A researcher already in a career takes a much higher risk and must face both a stalled career, even complete disgrace and condemnation by his or her peers. Plus another factor, researchers will have absorbed most of the content of academic integrity. They would know, as we all know, almost by heart, the kind of presentations of academic integrity that I started out with. If they didn't meet it during their student years, they must have at least encountered it during their PhD training and subsequently through practice and work in the academic quality culture, to use such a term, if that is a sound culture, of course. But in many places, I think it is. The emergency exits for the scholars are also fewer, but they do exist, of course. A person I happen to know, this was many years ago, was disclosed with dishonest behavior after due examination. This was with the Swedish university. This person moved abroad, literally to the other side of the world, and got a fairly good academic position there. Don't ask me how it was possible, but there seem to be ways, in particular when you cross cultures. But the cost, socially, mentally, professionally, is very high, which of course is a moral lesson. However, when you come into a field such as this, of academic integrity and all its various pitfalls, having lived your entire adult life in an academic community, and in my case in many countries, it is still, I think, a bit surprising to find so much energy put into something that is, after all, quite elementary. What is expressed in these manifestos, these policies, these statements, is the most basic articulation of rules of conduct. So this has puzzled me, it still puzzles me. So let me return to the concept of honor. Honor is related to honesty, I already said that. You have and earn your honor by being honest. You wish to have a good standing in the eyes of others, and this has been really true for professions since the age of the Giles. And certainly it was true for scholars. In the early modern period, the scholastic ideal was gradually superseded by a demand on method, with leading thinkers such as Bacon and Boyle and the ideologists of the modern scientific methodology. Through Enlightenment and onward into the world of modern knowledge production, this orientation, this new way of thinking scientifically, grew in itself into a code of conduct for academics. So you may have already thought about this, but much of the ethics of what we now call academic integrity originates in method. So I want to sort of juxtapose this question of method with the question of honor, with a deeper past. So when academia was a pure elite activity, this code of conduct could more easily spread among the small groups involved, I think. Supervision and control was also easier. So it is mass higher education that creates the major shift in this culture. Heterogeneity then grows. The distance between research and education also widens, despite the gospel of the opposite, actually. When student markets then globalize and commercialize under constant expansion, which has been the case now for a couple of generations, what becomes increasingly at sale in the academic world is a diploma, a degree, rather than gentlemanly scholarship. So, and I think in this, just as a parenthesis, we may remember, for example, the philosopher G.E. Moore in Cambridge, his contempt for the PhD degree. He didn't think highly about that. Taking on in new talents to the philosophy department, there is no need for a PhD. You know already who are good. You observe them in class. I think this kind of statement from just after the war is about the closeness in the community of scholarly activity. We are no longer there. We are somewhere else. And I think that is really what is behind this intense interest in this kind of version of academic integrity that I've presented to you. And this also functioned better as long as the classes were small. Now we have to defend the academic virtues against the multiple forces that threaten the very properties of our institutions. And hence, I think we have started at Rutgers University by McCabe, to make explicit what was always both, in a sense, obvious and true. And that is the way I can try to explain this seeming paradox that I've been working in academia for more than 40 years and never come across this concept until I was asked to give this lecture, in a sense. Finally, now, a few words by way of conclusion and also sort of opening up some prospects for our conversation on how we could perhaps think a bit bigger about academic integrity. And I think one way is to widen the scope to the institutional and organizational levels and not just address questions of behavior and morals of the individual. Universities, they rightly claim their wish to do good things, but they tend to be less articulate about what that means. They often say that being proactive can be problematic. Certainly no activism, there's some red lines and danger words. The other way is to think about quality and freedom as related precisely to integrity, and what is the relations between these things. So I've tried to just reflect a little bit on these academic keywords or code words that I mentioned briefly: academic collegiality, academic freedom, academic integrity, and academic responsibility, which seems to me a rising concept. And let me share some very sort of immature ideas about this. And the basic idea is that I have here is that there is a certain tension between these concepts. And I propose for our conversation that the freedom concept is perhaps, well, it was when we started discuss also perhaps earliest, and we cherish this freedom. I think it's also the most widespread of these concepts. That it is sort of a concept we like because it allows us to expand in many ways. And you could say that there is also an expansionist understanding of this freedom. You could define this academic freedom as the freedom to take all kinds of decisions in the institutions. And then I go back actually in the Swedish case to the 2009 public inquiry by Daniel Tarschys, if you remember that, where he proposed more autonomy for universities. And then the reform in 2011 came, the so-called autonomy reform, but it was a quite limited reform. Those who had big visions about this autonomy were disappointed. But anyway, it was something. And it reflected, I think, a long period of growing freedom on a global scale. A period of liberty and even libertarianism and all sorts of freedoms. And those should also include the university. And remember, from these days, it's not very long ago, they should be able to take more decisions, write contracts of all kinds with other countries, with companies, and so on. They should have more possibilities to accept donations. They should be more independently acting in relation to state and government. This was some of the content of this expansionist ideology of academic freedom on the institutional level. Also cherished among us as academics is, of course, the rights of freedom for the individual researcher to teach whatever we want, and these three freedoms that I mentioned. We should also be able to accept students from all over the world. Internationalism was underscored, and perhaps a more mixed blessing was that we could also have more freedom in searching our funding, but on the other hand, we had less core funding. We also now face challenges to this freedom. For example, we now face questioning who should be on our university boards. Should we have security classing of members of the university boards? We also have a focus on security issues, and we have new articulations of the national interest. So the freedom is restricted also by certain forces. And I think that so you have the freedom concept is there. If you look at the other concepts, like, for example, academic responsibility and academic integrity, they have a different tonality. They are more about the student and the researcher in the university adhering to certain principles and codes. I've mentioned several already, but you could also think about the concept of responsibility. When you represent your university, or you represent the academia in relation to other actors in society, you should observe certain norms and rules of behavior that are academic in their in their qualities. And that seems to me to sort of hold back. What I take home from this encounter with academic integrity is that there are certain obligations that stand in some kind of relationship with freedom, they hold the freedom back, so to speak. And they are now added from the state also, that the state that previously wanted more autonomy to increase the output for universities now also look very much at the national interest, and they look at other restricting factors. And let's look finally at what responsibility might mean. We could, for example, introduce concepts like sustainability, gender equality, climate action, peace, other factors that universities certainly could, perhaps should, take on. Are they part of academic responsibility? How would they fit in a scheme of academic integrity? Well, I don't think that's obvious. So I think we have this freedom, a sort of a relation of tension between the freedom, the idea of the academia as a very, very wonderful place where we can do certain things very freely, also with pretty large basic funding to do this. And we have our ideology for that, so to speak, also that we have articulated in the university. But still we also embrace a number of factors that, in a sense, hold us back. And we now find that state, government, and other forces in society also actually want to hold us back. So I'm suggesting that this is an even more interesting discussion than maybe we first think about when we come to a week like this and have all the good words up there, one word per day, so to speak. And and I must admit that I didn't think so much about that before. But now, having been immersed in academic integrity for a couple of weeks, I must say I'm already starting to think a little bit more about these things. And thanks for bearing with me, reminiscing and talking about these things for the last 45 minutes or so. Thank you.